The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was released in November 1998 for the Nintendo 64. This game was released exactly 7 years after the previous console Zelda, A Link to the Past for the Super Nintendo, and around 5.5 years after Link's Awakening for the Game Boy. It is notorious for having a long and complicated development period, with producer Shigeru Miyamoto to quote Nintendo itself, appending the T-table and basically restarting the whole project twice. Even worse, late in the project there was a change from the ill-fated Nintendo 64 disk drive to the basic Nintendo 64, which meant less storage space and memory and forced the team to greatly cut back on their ambition. Even so, the resulting product is widely regarded as one of the best, if not the best game of all time. This game defined a generation, to the point where it was very common back in the day to see people, even as the internet started growing, think that this game was the very first in the Zelda series. And, in some ways, it is. In the mid to late 90s, the video game landscape was changed forever by the switch to 3D graphics. In those times, it was suddenly almost unthinkable for a game to stay 2D. Almost every notable game series had to make the transition. The problem is, transitioning from 2D gameplay to 3D is not as simple as adding a new dimension. Take Mario, for example. Once the Nintendo 64 came around, the series' gameplay changed from having 70 mostly linear levels where the objective was simply reaching the end, to having 15 large and open-ended stages where the objective was mostly exploration. This happened both because developers and players wanted to explore this 3D landscape, and because the vast levels of Super Mario World simply wouldn't be possible with the 3D hardware of the time. Sonic, in particular, famously suffered in the transition. Not only is the traditional 2D Sonic gameplay very hard to adapt to 3D, the Blue Hedgehog only came into existence a whole generation after Mario to begin with. Appropriately, it would be another whole generation until Sonic finally got a 3D adventure, and even so with mixed results. With their positive experience with Mario 64, Nintendo started developing the next Zelda game on the same engine, but reinventing most of the basic mechanics from A Link to the Past. With the change to 3D, Nintendo effectively created new series out of their own franchises. The 2D incarnations of both series survived in portables, and, as the years went by and 2D once again became an acceptable form of gameplay, eventually established themselves as their own separate entities. 2D Mario and 3D Mario are based on different concepts, with only Mario 3D Land and Mario 3D World eventually closing that gap. It is the same with Zelda, of course. The 2D-style top-down Zelda games, like A Link to the Past, Spirit Tracks, and A Link Between Worlds, are completely different beasts from the 3D ones, like Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess. Before I get into it, though, let's talk a little about what defines a Zelda game. Starting from A Link to the Past for the Super Nintendo all the way to A Link Between Worlds for the 3DS, almost every Zelda game has some very strong tropes that repeat almost without failure. You play as a hero who might or not be called Link, who starts his adventure being woken up by a very literal call to adventure. You'll soon get a sword and shield, and alternate between an overworld and dungeon areas. The overworld is where almost every NPC is, and also where most of the plot happens. The dungeons are separate areas where you follow a repeated pattern of finding keys by solving puzzles, and also usually finding new equipment that allows Link to solve new types of puzzles and break new obstacles. Each new equipment opens up new areas in the overworld, which may both advance the plot or simply give you extra stuff, usually in the form of money or pieces of heart, which increase your maximum health. The Zelda games released until Ocarina of Time have a top-down view which allows the player to have an immediate and clear view of whatever is present in any area. These games also tend to have very simple combat, with Link being able to do nothing more than a simple horizontal slash and the spin attack. This results in the games having a very low complexity, making them very fast to just pick up and play. Again, using A Link to the Past as an example, within less than 5 minutes of starting the game, you are already equipped with a sword and shield and deep into an introductory dungeon, while in Ocarina of Time, by the 5-minute mark, the opening has barely ended. With the transition to 3D, many of the weird quirks of the 2D games would be hard to swallow in a more realistic setting. Link is not a small deformed sprite anymore, and, for example, having him unable to clear knee-high obstacles would be very strange. Having a more realistic setting requires the character to be able to interact with the world in a more realistic way, or else the player's immersion is very easily broken. Take Dark Souls, for example, widely regarded as one of the most immersive games of all time. But all that goes out of the window the moment your character is blocked by a knee-high barrier. Regarding the puzzle solving, in 3D Zelda, instead of watching everything that's going on from above, the world is all around you. As a result, understanding the environment itself is part of the game's challenge, and many puzzles revolve around surveying the environment and finding switches that allow Link to progress when they're hit. Perhaps the biggest change in the core gameplay was the importance combat has. Instead of the simple combat of previous games, Ocarina of Time introduced the Z-targeting system. With this, the player can enter what amounts to a combat mode, where Link's stance changes and the camera stays focused on one enemy. This system, created after the development team saw a play in an amusement park which included a dramatized fight of a samurai against 20 ninja, is the basis upon almost every third-person game with close quarters combat built upon. From Dark Souls to For Honor, this is where it started. This system creates a gap between the puzzle solving and the combat, lending much more weight and importance to the combat sequences than before. To further increase the importance of these moments, the game's ambient music now changes to a combat theme every time an enemy is nearby. In 2D Zelda, you're constantly fighting enemies, but they don't necessarily represent high-tension moments in the gameplay. In 3D Zelda, almost every enemy is a high-tension moment. While 2D Zelda scales difficulty by adding more enemies that deal increasingly absurd amounts of damage, 3D Zelda does it by increasing the power of the enemies itself, but not much their numbers. This can be seen by comparing how certain common enemies behave in each game. In the SNES game, the Stalfos are simple skeletons that, from the very first dungeon, appear in great numbers and occasionally throw bones at the player. In Ocarina of Time, they are very powerful enemies that appear in pairs and fight Link using a sword and shield. Even when fighting said pairs, the one the player isn't targeting usually just hangs back and waits. They also appear far less frequently, starting only at the 4th dungeon as mini-bosses and making very few appearances. Enemies in 3D Zelda also rarely represent as much of a threat as the ones in 2D Zelda. Even in the most recent 2D style games, every enemy beyond the game's midpoint already deals multiple hearts of damage, while hardly anything even gets to 1 heart in Ocarina of Time. The ultimate result of all these adaptations to the three-dimensional space is that 3D Zelda games have a bigger complexity than their 2D counterparts. Between learning how to navigate the more complex space and getting used to the new combat system, there is much more to learn in those games. This results in the experience having a somewhat slower pace, as the game has to avoid overwhelming players with information. The slower pace is usually mostly felt in how the games begin. Ocarina of Time starts, much like Mario 64, by letting the player roam free in an environment where they can learn the ropes without risk. Kokiri Forest. This initial area is full of situations and NPCs that explain every basic action Link can execute in this game. Differently from the castle grounds in Mario 64, however, the player is actually locked inside Kokiri Forest until Link can acquire a sword and a shield. The sword is found in a chest, while the shield has to be purchased with 40 rupees that have to be found scattered throughout the forest. It is precisely while searching for these 40 rupees that players will slowly come to terms with how this game works. It might seem like a slow beginning, but when you put it in context of it being one of the very first games of its kind, in a time where open 3D worlds were a completely new thing, it makes much more sense. Another factor that helps 3D Zeldas to have a slower pace is a bigger differentiation between the overworld and the dungeons. In the 2D games, while most of the action takes place in dungeons, the overworld is still full of puzzles and enemies. In Ocarina of Time, certainly due to hardware limitations, Hyrule Field is a big but mostly empty space. All the hidden areas are basically holes found under rocks that lead to very similar caves. In interviews around the time Twilight Princess for the GameCube and Wii was released, producers Shigeru Miyamoto and Eiji Aonuma mentioned that Link was supposed to be able to fight with the sword on horseback in Ocarina of Time, but the Nintendo 64 was not powerful enough to achieve that. The result is clearly seen in how Hyrule Field, especially as adult Link, is almost completely devoid of any life. Of course, this doesn't mean all the action happens inside dungeons, but in A Link to the Past, the enemies outside of dungeons are a very real threat, while the few monsters in the open air in Ocarina of Time are little more than a nuisance. The overworld became a place almost fully focused on advancing the plot and making the world an open, big, and more believable place, more than simply filler. If the world of Ocarina of Time was as compressed as the one in A Link to the Past, it would be much less believable as a real world than it is with all the empty space. This is another trade-off of the more realistic graphics. The more video gamey world of the 2D game, with all its arbitrary barriers and blocky visuals, wouldn't be immersive if mixed with more realistically proportionate characters and a new camera. As a result of this decompressed world, the downtime between enemy encounters or puzzles is much bigger. The only 3D Zelda that tried to bridge this gap and had a smaller, closed-off and more densely packed overworld was Skyward Sword, with mixed results. But that is a story for another video. Finally, with the transition to 3D, came a much bigger emphasis on the plot. Ocarina of Time has many cutscenes that make the whole experience feel much more cinematic, in a time where saying that of a game brought none of the mixed feelings it does nowadays. Perhaps the biggest change is how Link himself is portrayed, or more appropriately, the fact that he has any sort of action in those cutscenes, while previous games have him without any action, leaving the players to fill in the blanks with their own minds. All those differences are the reason I say Ocarina of Time is the first of its series, in a way. It changed the basic gameplay of Zelda in many very strong ways and created a completely new style of game that persisted on the big console titles all the way to Skyward Sword, leaving the classic 2D formula to the portable titles. With this, we have a general idea of what we're going into, and we know the context in which this game was released. On the next part of this series, we'll take a deeper look at the game's controls and combat. Next time though, we return to Super Mario World for the third and final part of our analysis. Once again, thank you very much for watching this all the way to the end. If you liked this video, please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing on your platform of choice. If you're interested, check out my other videos on Pokémon, Undertale, Mario, and Mega Man. Thank you again, and until next time.